Speaking of what we're speaking of parents and elders, see, you have to remember that certain people in the for their world, they have a setting. Like to them, maybe the family is the whole world. And sometimes some people hold up an entire world. So speaking of that, let's move to this. Uh, Allah, see, if you're going to live, leave a legacy. There is a Sahabi by the name of Qais ibn Asim al-Minqari. Now, he lived from pre-Islam. He's one of these people that reaches an incredibly long life. But what's interesting is way before Islam, in Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic Arabia, he has an incredible reputation. Okay. He is from Tamim, from Banu Tamim. And he has this reputation of what they call Hilm, which is this composure and mixed with wisdom. And he's the kind of guy that people turn to. And it's phenomenal because he not only had such a legacy in Jahiliyyah, in pre Islamic Arabia, but even in Islam, he reached Islam and embraced Islam. And he had a phenomenal legacy within Islam as well. And he's one of the few people that managed to do that. His name was Qais ibn Asim al-Minqari, al-Tamimi, from the tribe of Tamim. And it's amazing. And I thought that since we spoke about legacy, to show that he actually came from or arose out of these ashes, in like the phoenix rising, which was a past of his that was horrible. He was one of those people that actually buried their daughters alive, and some say he was one of the most known, as in whether some have even said maybe he began the tradition, but I don't know if that's true. But he, as a figure, like as somebody, because Bani Tamim were kind of rated, and he was one of the, like, wow, the Sayyid, one of these huge people of Bani Tamim. He did this as a young man, and look at the most vicious thing to do, to bury an innocent, beautiful child alive in the sand. And Allah says about this, فَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ, that when this child will be asked, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ, why was she killed? With which crime? This verse being exemplified, instantiated by this person in this kind of darkness. And you can imagine that guilt must have killed him, carrying that kind of shadow around with you. And he rose from this, and he went on to kind of deny certain lifestyles upon himself. And he was one of those people way before Islam to just on himself prohibit alcohol. He declared it haram for himself. And he became incredibly generous, and he was very kind of he had this composure about him that people rated him for. The whole of Banu Tamim would look up to him. And he was also known in battles as well, but he was, when he developed this kind of composure, it was just this, he had this aura about him that carried such a reputation. And in Islamic literature, there's a personality known as Al-Ahnaf ibn Qais, who's also from Bani Tamim. And he is, when people would say historically, who is the most poetic of people, who is the most knowledgeable of people, who is the most. So there was a saying that that who is Ahlam al-Arab, or ahlam al-nas, the most well composed of Arabs. And they had a saying, is this is in Islamic times, that al-Ahnaf ibn Qais, and he was known for this. And he was somebody that when the whole fighting broke out initially, of the Battle of the Camel, he withdrew and didn't take sides with anyone, not with Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, not with Aisha radiallahu anhu, but he just kind of withdrew his whole thing. And he was known. And he was asked, where did you learn this composure from? And he says, I, as a young man, he says, I learnt it from Qais ibn Asim al-Minqari. He says, one day I was at his place, and he says, and two young men were brought in. One was dead, and the other had been kind of all captured. And he says, and we were astounded that what's this? And he says, and the dead one, it turned out, was Qais ibn Asim's son. And the one that was now kind of captured was his nephew. And he says, and I looked to him like thinking, what's about to happen here? Like all hell's going to break. And this is the Sayyid. This is somebody who Banu Tamim were already one of those people that that used to boast about their strength. And I've mentioned this before, they were one of these tribes that have this about them, we're the dons of the Arabs. And he's their Sayyid. And I'm not just saying this, even in the year of delegation, he approaches the Prophet in the 9th year of Hijri. So much later, he approaches the Prophet in this delegation of Banu Tamim. And the Prophet says to him, he says, Marhaban, he says, welcome to Sayyid. He says, Hada Sayyid Ahl al-Wabr. He says, because the nomadic kind of Arabs that moved about were called Ahl al-Wabr. And he says, this is the Sayyid of them, the leader of all of those. That's how he was. He was right. So Ahnaf says, when I looked at Qais, I thought, damn, I don't know what's going to happen here. And he says, this man was so composed. He says he looked at them and he obviously expressed grief over his son being killed. And he says he said to the people, let go of the other one, like release him. They released him, and he said to him that, what have you done? He said, you only hurt yourself, and you hurt your own immediate family. This was his own cousin. He said, you decreased your strength because of this tribe. This was your cousin. This is your immediate kind of backup. And he says, and you've just, brought tears to his loved ones. And then he says to the people around and to this murderer that he says to, who's his nephew, that he says, help wash him and shroud him. And then he says that to the people that were around, that the blood money for this, he says, take it, obviously, because he had wealth, he says, take it and go to his mother, because his mother was in a different place, staying somewhere else. That particular child's mother was obviously his wife. Maybe she was separated from him at the time from Qais. He says, and give her that blood money, because he says that she already is lonely. And it was like so many camels and all this stuff. This composure, Ahnaf was saying, I was bewildered by it. I was like, I couldn't even get my head, what on earth have I just witnessed? Never have I seen people that composed. And it was said about him, this is that Banu Tamim, and especially his immediate kind of subclan, were all kind of held up by this guy. And when he passes away, he gives some amazing advice to his kind of sons. He gathers them and he tells them, and this is it. His whole advice is about ethics, about reminding them about goodness and reminding them to keep calm in the face of adversity. And there was a poem said about him when he passed away, that there's a poet, Abdat ibn Tabib, who says about him, Salamullahi alayka Qais ibn Asim, wa rahmatuhu ma sha'a an yatarahama. That, may Allah's mercy be on you that you've passed away. فما كان قيس هلكه هلك واحد لكنه بنيان قوم تهدم. Allah. He says Qais, his passing away was not just the passing away of an individual. لكنه بنيان قوم. It is the foundation of a building, that foundation of a whole people that has collapsed. Allah. And that is, this was defined as later poets like Abul Ala al-Minqari, who we've spoken about in previous sessions. He said this was the Arthal Bayt Qalatul Arab, the best kind of eulogizing poem that a poem said about somebody that's passed away, the best line ever said, that the Arabs ever said. That فَمَا كَانَ قَيْسٌ هُلْكُهُ هُلْكَ وَاحِدٍ. Hulk is from halak. Okay, his destruction was not the destruction, or his passing was not of just one person. هُلْكَ وَاحِدٍ لَكِنَّهُ بُنْيَانُ قَوْمٍ تَهَدَّمَ. But it is the foundation of a whole people that has kind of given way. And people are like that sometimes. Sometimes we spoke just earlier on about family members, about parents. Sometimes a parent can be like that they hold an entire family together. That their passing, everything gives way. See, it's amazing seeing that, and it also is a testimony to the legacy that these people leave behind. Right, yeah. So speaking of in his time, see, one of the things is interesting because he says when he's passing away, just before he's like on his deathbed, Qais ibn Asim says, "Don't bury me in the land of Bakr ibn Wa'il, which was part of Rabi'ah." He says, because in my days, he says, in my days, we were at loggerheads. We participated in some wars. And he says, and I don't want them kind of just, mutilating my grave. Because there was, in many years before, Rabi'ah in Jahili times had this huge battle with Tamim. There was, they had a huge tiff going on, because Rabi'ah were also these solid Arabs. Proper, like, relentless in their way. And from them, the subclans, these kind of Bakr ibn Wa'il and Banu Taghlib, and all these people that we've spoken of.